Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me today on this special live stream. My name is Michael Watson. I lead DevRel at Apollo. We're going to be talking about MCP server and specifically the Apollo MCP server and some developer workflows about building MCP tools using that library and, kind of my workflow of kind of how I go about building out servers and what I've been seeing at hackathons. So let's switch over to my screen and let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So today we're going to be building an MCP server and some tools specifically for the space devs effort. I have a GraphQL API built over the space devs REST API. Gives a lot of information about launches, missions, kind of everything in space. So before we jump into the MCP portion, for anyone who might not be familiar with GraphQL, let's just quickly talk about what GraphQL is. On the screen, I have Apollo Explorer Sandbox, which I have that graph running locally, and I'm able to use this tool to really explore into my graph. And one of the nice things about GraphQL is the ability for developers to, add in fields, select what data they want. GraphQL is very well known for the overfetching, underfetching, how to solve that type of problem. And what's really great about GraphQL as far as an API layer for AI is we're able to give the right context of what the data being returned back from our API is. Meaning, there's certain fields that are going to be relevant for whatever tool, whatever thing I'm trying to do. There's other fields that aren't going to be relevant. It's just going to be add noise. And that does a couple things. It adds potential confusion or hallucinations that can happen as you add in kind of noise into that context window. And then the other thing it does is just it increases the number of context tokens, right? So that overall spend of compute for your LLMs continues to increase. Like one of the use cases I've seen, I was working with Mercedes-Benz has a REST API for their car configurator. And I found that if I sent an API request to get all of the car models available for the German market, that API response from that REST API endpoint actually exceeds the context window for Claude. It was like over 1 million tokens. So GraphQL lets you select which fields are going to be relevant in that. And that's actually a way how I was able to bring that response in and get below the context window threshold. There's also other things of filtering your API responses, but it's definitely an important piece here. Now, I've written out a couple just operations. This is actually one from the MCP server repository. We're going to start out from scratch in just a minute, but I just wanted to demonstrate a little bit around the GraphQL aspect. So in here, we have things around, how many options we can limit, the search. These are all arguments inside of GraphQL. And those arguments, you can really just think as like the URL parameters for your REST API potentially. And as we put that information in, we can execute that data. The response of the data from GraphQL is always going to follow a similar structure of each one of these fields. Now, the API we're using, we have a lot of requests coming in here. It is a public API that doesn't necessarily need an API key, so anyone can use it out there. It's not quite as fast. You can see it took 14 seconds, but we just got some information about the upcoming launches. And really what's going on behind the scenes, and this is, I think, fundamental to what we call graph-based API orchestration. These fields that are being selected in this operation, from a client's perspective, it's really just one request, right? This one GraphQL request with these fields selected. But from the backend standpoint, this one request could be reaching out to multiple APIs, right? And really what your graph is giving you is it's giving you an API orchestration layer. So your AI doesn't have to act as the API orchestration layer in the form of its tools, right? A tool should encapsulate the functionality of what's needed in there. And if we look at this, we call this a query plan in GraphQL. And it's basically this incoming request is being translated into these steps, these fetches that are going to happen downstream. And you can see that there's specific information that has to be got about an individual launch that's coming back from that list of launches to get some of the other data that's kind of in this field selection set. So it's really important to note that, with each one of these GraphQL operations, there is a deterministic sequencing that's happening in the form of this query plan. And this is all there so AI doesn't have to dream it up, right? AI is just picking the tool of the functionality now that is associated with this operation that gets all the fields inside of there, right? So what we're going to start doing today, working with this API, is we're actually going to go through and we're going to build out MCP tools for these GraphQL operations. So we're going to encapsulate all the functionality of one of our API calls in a GraphQL operation. Now, let's jump over to VS Code and look at our project. So I've done a couple things. I've really I took our schema from that API that's running, just right here, agency, astronauts, this is basically this schema. So what I did is I just came into here, I clicked on the schema SDL. One of the things about GraphQL with the deterministic strongly typed schema, you get that through introspection as one of the options in your GraphQL servers. So you could be running another, GraphQL API, anything. All you really need is this schema. So I just really copied this and then in VS Code, paste it into this schema file. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to get started with the Apollo MCP server. So if I went to the docs for Apollo, we have some Apollo MCP documentation in here. There's a lot of information here. I strongly recommend you check out this after the stream. There's a quick start with information, and we have this section about how to get the MCP server. It's very similar to how you work with a lot of Apollo's technology. If you've used the Apollo router in the past, it's just a single command that you could run to install that. So I basically have ran this command, and that's this Apollo MCP server. That's right there. So if I did Apollo MCP server -- help, here's all of the help outputs from that MCP server. And just like all our other Apollo resources, just a Rust-based binary that we're invoking. Now, I have done a couple things also. We're going to be showing some brand new features, actually. We're going to be showing some hot reloading stuff that is really exciting. What I've done is I've actually built the Apollo MCP repository. So let me pull that up real quick. Apollo MCP. So this is the server with that binary that we had just downloaded installed. I have a branch in here that's associated with this. Am I already logged in? I'm not going to Okta if I have to. All right, cool. There's this hot reload operation, files and directories. I'm going to be using that branch. So although I just showed you how to install that binary, I'm not going to use this binary. We're going to use that branch. And I've done a couple other things. I like VS Code a lot, so I set up a couple of things in here. One, I set up a little terminal profile inside of here. That's just like something that automatically populates in this terminal window. The bigger thing is I like setting up some tasks. So I set up one for starting an MCP server and starting the MCP inspector. This MCP inspector is a general purpose tool released by Anthropic for the Model Context Protocol and allows us to look at tools, look at the server that we're building, and we're going to use that to explore. I also have that running right here in the background. And if we went back to Chrome, we can see here's that MCP inspector. So we kind of have the workings of starting with exploring it, but we haven't actually started up our MCP server. So right here, I have a task that I'm just going to walk through the options before I run this. So we have a command. This command is basically what I just wrote here earlier with the Apollo MCP server. I'm actually just pointing, though, at where I have that repository cloned, and I'm building that binary from source code so I can have that hot reloading stuff. All of that will come out in the next couple days. So if you're watching this, probably all this stuff is already shipped. I just wanted to show the latest. Then we have the arguments of what we provide to the Apollo MCP server. MCP servers typically have a directory. So that directory, I'm just pointing to the folder that I have open. This makes all the rest of the options for our MCP server work from this as the base URL. So for example, we're providing the schema. I could just say schema.graphql because that file is in the directory. I'm going to turn on introspection. We're going to talk about this tool in a second. This is a really great tool for helping us author out our operations, and we'll get to see that in action. I have an endpoint. So this is actually where I'm running my GraphQL server. So I'm running mine locally. I have it at localhost 4000. So that's why I have that here. SSE port. So currently the Apollo router, Apollo MCP server supports both standard input-output transport and server-side events transport. Server-side events is something that's just kind of the old way of doing things in MCP protocol. Streaming HTTP is becoming a new thing. And specifically, if you look at the inspector, you can see the three options. Streamable HTTP is starting to supersede server-side events. So we'll be working on supporting that in the future as well as that starts to pick up steam. But for today, we're just going to run it on server-side events. I think this is also a great option, especially when you're running MCP servers locally, where you kind of have control on your machine. I think it's when you go to hosting your servers where the server-side events is not as favorable as a lot of the streaming HTTP options. And then finally, we're going to just point at a folder, this operations folder. There's nothing in it, but this is where we're going to basically put the tools that we author inside of here. And that's it. That's all the options of what we need to start our MCP server. So I'm going to use the VS Code run task. This is the command palette. If you're not familiar with VS Code, you can go to View, Command Palette. I do the Command Shift P to open that up. I'm going to click Run Task, and then I'm going to run my MCP start, which is starting up that MCP server. So you can see, just to look at the terminal output, it, for example, got that schema, did some stuff with it, started up, loaded 0 operations, got the server up and running. So now we can connect to our server running. And so if we go back to that MCP inspector, click connect, we now have some tools available. And what's really cool here is that introspection argument we provided gives us this introspect and this execute tool. The introspect tool is really cool. I really like this because this gives the LLM the ability to start traversing our graph and entering at a specific node. For example, if I was just looking at, the query and depth of 1, you'll see that it just returned basically what that root query type is from our schema. And so this tool allows the LLM to start looking at different pieces. So we're going to use this tool now to start building out operations, right? Like I could go, into this little explorer, we can come in, we can start clicking through things, but, this API is already starting to get a little large. You might be working with an API that's larger, and building out that initial operation, it could be as simple as a couple clicks where, I want to click in the filters, I want to click in the results. I just want to add all the fields. You could go through and do that. But you might want to get a starting point. So I'm going to show you how I use the introspection tool to start or create a starting point. Now, for my assistant today, I'm going to be using Goose. Goose is, let me pull up actually the repo because I want to do the Goose Crew group from Block. And everything they're doing in that open source world. A little shout out because I really like this. I like there being more MCP client applications out there. So Goose is a CLI and a desktop app that you could use with open source LLMs, lots of different things. You can extend it with MCP servers. It's kind of like your terminal CLI assistant. So I thought instead of showing Claude Desktop or one of those other tools, let's actually show the Goose CLI through all of this. So there's this command, goose configure, and this allows you to configure a couple things. Now, I already have everything configured for my provider. We're going to start out with using Claude. Well, then we'll switch over to Qwen and see what that looks like with Ollama locally. But I'm going to need to add an extension. And so this is where I have a couple options. It's not a built-in extension. It's going to either be a command line extension or a remote extension. If you want to use the standard input-output transport from Apollo, you could basically take all of those argument options, those commands that I showed for the SSE, server-side events, and put it in that command line. For us, since we're already running that server, I'm just going to use my remote extension, HTTP localhost 5000 SSE. Oh, whoops. That's, let me do that again. That's not what I want to name it. I want to call it the space devs. And the URL is that. Okay, give it a little timeout. I don't need a description or environment variables for this. So now we've added our MCP server that we have running locally to Goose. And now we just need to start a session, which you can just type Goose to start that. So you can see we're using AWS Bedrock as our model in the background. Claude, I've tried a couple different models. Claude is definitely one that I've found a lot of great success with this, but it is a little over powerful, for what we're going to be doing here. So we'll look at what it looks like with Quen in a second. So let me get my menu bar out of the way. There we go. Okay, so now we can start asking questions like, okay, what root? Ooh, I'm yelling at Goose. What root fields are available on the schema? Right, and so now I'm basically just asking a question about our schema, what we have inside of there. And this is, I actually have been in a bunch of AI demos lately, and we had a couple people, we were talking and joking about the time in between waiting for the LLM to run when you ask a question giving demo, and like the anxiety you have of like, what's it doing? Is it doing the right thing? But I love it. So you can see right here, it said, let me introspect the schema. It looked at that query root, and based off the results it got, you can see it started giving us information about this, right? So it got agencies, kind of all of these different things inside of there. And then I can ask to explore more. So like, I want to write one that's around astronauts. What fields are available for the astronaut? Ooh, astronaut. So now you can see it's still using that same tool, but now it's starting to inspect at different type names. And that's because the previous conversation, the previous question, the tool results, that's all in the context message history. So now we start getting a lot of information here. Okay, cool. Now, can you generate me an operation to get a list of astronauts in that are currently in space? Give it a little more information. Now, this is where things can kind of start to get a little random. I'm gonna. I think here is a great example where you have this curious nature of what you're kind of providing with the LM with these tools of being able to kind of query things and get more information. You can see that now it's starting to layer in that execute tool. So behind the scenes, it's writing, an introspection query, getting some of that information, building a query, testing it, changing that, building another query, testing that. And the control there, is kind of going to be dependent a lot on the assistant of what you have in there. I have found differences between Claude desktop, for example, with Goose. How many times it runs that introspection, how far it traverses. That's kind of the dynamic aspect of the LLM. So let's take a look at what it got back. So it gave us a list of the agencies, everything. It gave us information. It didn't actually give us what the query shape is. What is the query body that you used? See, I kind of wish it would have given me that information back. Instead, it just gave me the data that it got back, which is great. I do want that data, but I do want to get that operation. All right. So here we go. Now we have the query of the astronauts in space. This is great, right? This has everything that we need inside of here. So now we can take this and start bringing this in as a tool. So I'm going to copy this value. What I always like to do is I like to just validate my operation. So for example, here's kind of here, if I come in here, just press play, I get data back. So perfect. Things are working inside of this. But I might also want to change what's in here a little bit, right? So I can see that there's other things involved in here, like date of birth, date of death. Those may be fields I want to add inside of there. There's a lot of directions I can go in this. I also can see there's filters. Were there other filter values that maybe I want to put in? I do want to have a limit, but do I want to like have it be 20? Maybe that limit for the LLM should only be 5 because it's going to get results. It's going to be able to paginate through them quickly. I want to maybe control that to a lower value. Once that's ready though, and I feel good with what I have built here, I can start doing a couple things. So one, I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to come back to VS Code. Actually, let's copy the name, astronauts in space. So I'm going to make this astronauts in space.graphql. Copy this, paste this in, and I'm going to save the file. Now, I see an error inside of here. It might have just messed up on my hot reload. We'll see in just a second. But before we switch over, I want to talk a little bit about the tools structure and everything. Every operation that we define, we have the ability to turn that into an MCP tool. There really isn't anything we need to do other than just have this operation and point our MCP server at it, which we've done. So if we went back to Inspector real quick, and let's see, reconnect. Yeah, it looks like maybe me starting with a blank folder is probably something that wasn't covered. So let's try this again. I just started the server up. Okay, so now we have this astronauts in space. Now notice this return value and everything in here. This is basically something that we automatically generate based off of the return type and the comments and things that are inside of the schema. And you'll notice that the astronauts in space, whatever the operation name you define is, that's what's going to change in there. And then if we want to change what the tool description is, we can actually write that in as a comment. So any comments we add to the top are automatically going to be put as that tool description, right? So this is the tool to paginate through the astronauts in space. Currently limited to 5 results per page. We'll just put that. I'm going to save this file. Now, hopefully we'll see if this didn't hot reload. Dang it. Of course, it wouldn't be a good AI demo if some of the latest things didn't quite work. I just got so excited last night, was like, I gotta try and show this to people. Okay. We'll see the hot reloading when we add an operation in there as well. But you can see that now that those comments are basically being pulled through as the description inside of here for that tool. So now we kind of have a flow where we could use our introspection tools to kind of naturally explore the graph, find information, create an operation, and then bring that into the fold and have our server start exposing those as tools. Now that we have this, let's actually go back and let's try that same exact workflow. But instead, let's see what it would look like with an Ollama provider. Right? So we're going to use Ollama. Now I have Qwen 3 installed. One of the things about Ollama, the Qwen models are the ones that support tools. That's why we have to use Qwen models with Ollama locally. Basically, you just need tools to be supported for MCP usage with LMs. Now that we have that, we can start our session up. And tell me let's just go through that same flow. Tell me about, or I need to find out information about upcoming launches. Can you tell me what fields are available? All right, and now we'll send it off. Now, one thing I will point out, I think one of the major differences I've seen between hosted models and Olama in a context like Goose is really just time. I've found Olama actually to do a pretty good job at or Olama with Quen to do a pretty good job at introspecting the schema, getting results. It's really just more the speed of responses. It's probably not also helping that I'm streaming right now. I got a couple things running with VS Code and everything, so my machine's not, it is just a MacBook. So the the performance here I would expect to be significantly less than the performance of, for example, what is being provided by some of the models like Anthropic or even AWS and like what's in there with Bedrock. Now, we can see it got a lot of information, actually. Quen also gives a little bit of reasoning inside of here, but you can see the details in here. I'm just going to write, can you write me an operation for that? While we wait, this is probably a good time. I did get a question that came through one of my channels about the models. Okay, it seems like I answered part of that question with that. I think the important thing about like the models inside of here, I mentioned Claude 3.7 is one of the better performing models and everything. Really about speed and everything in that. But you can see like right here, I did get a query that's got, all the information inside of it. It's more that we don't necessarily need a really powerful model to use with this. Actually identifying the proper tool and everything in the context of how we're using it, I've found success with a lot of models. I think it just starts to come down to cost of what models you use. So let's validate this operation now that we're here. Now here's a great example of validating the operation. There's like a bunch of stuff in here that is just not available. So like there isn't a status on launch. Like is there? Oh, there is. But status didn't have everything selected inside of it, right? So maybe I put status description, right? And it looks like, inside of here, Quen didn't do that great of a job of being able to pull out the right fields in that. Let's see. Locations, thing to select. Name, description. Okay. So we basically just fixed our little launch. Now it is also just launch. I said I wanted to do upcoming launches. There are other things here. I see upcoming launches inside of here. And this is where, sometimes the generate operation of what it provides is okay. Sometimes it's not so great. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in the upcoming launches. And I'm going to copy and pasta that whole inside over and just move us over. And I think this all needs to be wrapped in a results. Now we can format this. Where's that? There we go. Okay. So now we have upcoming launches. There's a couple extra things I can add in. I can add in a little search argument inside of here. I think that's kind of like a nice thing that gives the ability to search if you wanted to. You don't have to. And there's our results. Okay, so let's copy this, go back over to VS Code, get launch, or I'm going to call this get upcoming launches. Get upcoming launch details. Okay. And then I'm going to add in get upcoming launch with details. There is an optional search parameter. And I'll say something like, this is where a code or single word value works best. And I think what's really important here is as we create these argument values, you have a couple things we can do. One, I think adding in some little instructions about what those are, I've found is really helpful to the LLM and being able to guide, what's inside of there. There is also things we can do around like the argument values of what we provide, right? We can add our own naming and things inside of there. You can kind of see, here's that astronauts in space, the tool that just got put in there. I do see a little error that popped up. So let's see if I go back to MCP inspector and I clear. Dang, it didn't hot reload. Want. Okay, well, we'll just restart that server so we have that new tool. That's okay. Okay, there we go. So now we have get upcoming launch details inside of here with that search term. If I do something like Vandenberg, run the tool, get data back and everything. Awesome. And so now we have just added in like another tool, and really we can continue this workflow of just adding more tools and adding them into our MCP server, and then we can come back to our client, start a new session with Goose. With all the MCP clients, what I found, none of them really have like a refresh option for tools. You typically just have to start a new session. So like on Cloud Desktop, unfortunately, you have to like quit the desktop, restart it. Goose, you just have to restart a session, which is, I find a little easier than quitting an application. But now I can ask a question like, can you tell me about upcoming launches? Kind of wish there was like an application or something that was like a little meter bar for like your Olama instance or something of like, what's it doing? I love Olama because it works great, but there's also times where I'm like, I wonder what it's doing right now. But it always comes back with some results eventually. Okay, so we can see that it's actually now selecting that get upcoming launch details tool. And in the background, it's going to execute that for us. And then it should give us a summary of what that data is. All right. While we're waiting for this to run, I see a couple other questions. Yeah, in case of not using introspection, directly exposing the query's mutations from the Apollo router to the MCP, what automated ways can we build the API.GraphQL? Should we manually create the API.GraphQL? It's a great question. Just to show a little more details on the application that we have built here. Here's the window I actually have it running. We have this capability called Apollo connectors. You can see I've actually created a couple different connections. Each one of these essentially has a connector that's connecting with the REST API endpoints, and then selecting out what fields we want to map from like that REST API response into the GraphQL schema. So this is definitely a really quick, fast way to get up and running with a REST API as far as like building out a GraphQL schema. And there's a lot of different ways to build a GraphQL API. If you're not using REST, there's plenty of server libraries, whether that's like Apollo Server, or if you're in like Java, there's a Java GraphQL Spring Boot library example. Lots of different options out there. Let's check that tool response real quick. All right, so here we go. So here's the upcoming launches, right? You can see it's got some thinking, reasoning about, that. You can see it's talking about each one of its little responses inside of there. And then it creates a little summary, right? So here's one in Florida, here's one in China, and these are all ones happening just like today, right? And this is cool because it's all like very real data and everything inside of it. And now we've really shown how we could basically have kind of a quick way of us writing these operations, putting that in our MCP server, and then having that tool exposed. Now, I have a bunch of questions. This is actually just about right where I had the material created up to. So I think now would be a good time for me to actually start going through some of these questions and talking about it. So I got one from Philip. Can operation files be used when starting the MCP server using uplink instead of schema? Yes. I really just showed today how to use the MCP server with basically just like any GraphQL endpoint with like any GraphQL operations. But there's a lot of stuff inside of here. So in the command options, there's a couple things inside of here. There is schema, but there is also uplink. So you can use uplink if you just provide your Apollo key and your Apollo graph ref. That also works for the manifest. So if you provide the manifest option with the Apollo key, Apollo graph ref, it'll also connect to that persisted query manifest inside of GraphOS. So I didn't really show like the GraphOS side of the integration here. But all of that stuff is inside of there. So I definitely recommend you check out the options and command reference inside of here for that. From Hugh, can the MCP be used to develop schemas or just operations? For example, it'd be interesting to generating a starting schema based on SQL or REST schemas. That is a great question. I would say, one of the things I have explored is actually just using the LLM like in Cursor to just like write out schema type stuff. It does a pretty good job at that. I've also done things like I was just showing connectors. One of the things I've done is I've taken a couple of the things inside of here, like making request documentation, the handling responses documentation, the mapping language. I've taken a couple of these markdown files. You copy as markdown. And I've provided those files to Cursor, and it did help build like a schema based off of like an open API spec pretty well. There is definitely more coming in this world. I've been talking with the team about an MCP server that has some tools specifically around generating the schema. The Introspect tool that you have is really good at helping assist in updating, enhancing the schema. So asking questions about like, I need to add this field to this thing. Like, what would that go about? And it will do a good job at actually making suggestions into your schema based on that. I think there's still a little bit more that needs to be explored in that area, but definitely something I'd check out. Is MCP an additional license that we should purchase? Nope. You could use the MCP server today. Everything I just showed you for free. There is no paid option or thing about the MCP server. It's really just a general purpose binary that you could use to create a MCP server and MCP tools based off of any GraphQL operations with any GraphQL API. So you can go ahead and get started today. Installed. Don't have to worry about anything. I only had my API key and stuff inside of there. because I was doing some stuff with Apollo connectors, which that does require an account, but the MCP doesn't require any license or anything. Got a question. Will we be able to use the MCP, Apollo MCP, if we have a non-federated standalone graph and are not using the Apollo router in our GraphQL server? Yes, you can use the Apollo MCP server with any GraphQL API. You just need the schema and then the API endpoint. And really, the reason you need those things is the schema is needed to create this Introspect tool. It basically, takes that schema, loads it in as that tool of what's being parsed through inside of that. And then the endpoint is where it sends these execute requests and then any tools it creates as operations. So don't have to have a federated graph, don't have to have, anything like that. Even if you think about this API schema that's being sent, this is actually just the API schema from an introspection result. So really you can provide kind of a couple different modes of schemas. All of them work. Just any spec compliant schema is what you need. In case of using federated GraphQL, where supergraph is getting used to aggregate all the subgraph, how to pass the schema. Yeah, so in the example we had here, this actually is a federated graph. And the easiest way is if you're running the router locally, when you click on the SDL tab, it'll have this schema inside of here. So you can just go in and just copy this schema as it is, and it works. Another option, since there's a lot of questions about Apollo, I did also have pulled up in the background, I'm running this service in the background with Rover Dev, but you can actually pass a -MCP and then all the MCP operations the same. And then that will run the router locally, also run the server. Now, we do have a bug right now where the MCP server is showing unknown. So that's like a little thing that we're working on. My servers are also, the ports are overriding. But that is an option, out there, is being able to have Rover Dev work inside of that. When you're doing this, it's essentially using that schema in the background of what it's providing. Yeah, the next question from Luke. I think we covered this already. Can you update the tool description without updating the schema? Yep, you can. That's going to be the comments in the operations you write. I think that's the easiest way, and what I found actually myself doing that with pretty much every operation. What are some underrated features about the Apollo MCP server you wish other people knew about? Richard, what a fantastic question. I think honestly, I found like this comment, this is something that I found out when I was doing a lot of research with RAG and GraphQL operations. The comment was like super valuable. A lot of times people would look at how they add comments like into the JSON responses coming from the APIs. And I found that to get extremely difficult, especially when you start getting to, dozens, hundreds of tools, because you don't want the LLM having to spend its, computational, understanding on how do I orchestrate these tools together necessarily, right? The tool kind of should encapsulate everything inside of it. And this description is how you can actually really give a very bespoke, comment of what this thing does versus what's actually being generated from the comments in your schema. The comments in your schema, like sometimes they're not as helpful. Even like I look at like the GitHub schema, it's great, it has a lot of comments and everything like that. The auto-generated tool description from those comments, sometimes helpful, sometimes it's way off, not what you want, right? And I think, a good example is like the astronauts in space saying like, this is astronauts in space. I've seen, there might be an option where you want to do something like in space, is Boolean true, and then putting, that argument inside of here. And you want to give the LM the ability to, keep changing some things inside of here. That's definitely an option of what you want to have. And you're going to need some description stuff to make that. So I really think that's like one of the biggest features, in my opinion. There's a lot in there. I feel like that's a simple one, but like for guiding LLMs and how important prompting the right way is, this is very, very, very helpful in the tools we generate for our LLMs. I also just want to say, I know we're at time. We still got a bunch of questions. I'm going to keep going through all these questions and answer them, at least for just the video and the recording. So I'm going to keep going. If you have to drop or something, feel free to. We're going to have this recorded. It's like on our live stream through YouTube also, so you can check the video on the Apollo GraphQL YouTube. Okay, one question. Is there any way to pass the headers dynamically? Because that it can be dynamic token from the client. Yeah, so this is one of the questions really around like MCP in general. So there's a couple things inside of that. There's definitely a lot of ways to do enforcement in GraphQL. One of the ways that teams do it is using what we call @authenticated. And it's basically a directive that allows you to say like, hey, for this field, this user needs to be @authenticated. And you can also do things like there's like scopes, and you can provide a set of scopes for a or scopes or policies of what's required for a given field. What the Apollo router does is when an incoming request comes in there, we take the incoming token, send it to your identity provider, get those scopes, those policies, and we trim that query plan's execution path based on what that user has access to. Now, what that means is you need the token to get to the router, right? Versus like how do you get that through? There's kind of two worlds of assistance I see people building today. One is an application, right? Like you're trying to build that assistant into so many things. But like when you're building that assistant, you're going to have some OAuth flow like in that assistant UI, right? If you think of just like a normal website, I like log in, then I have that token, it gets sent along. Currently right now, the authentication in the Apollo router or the Apollo MCP server is something that we're investigating and adding in. Also, just authentication in the MCP protocol is a little bit of an absent aspect. And just to kind of give a little more details into here, when you look at like Claude Desktop and you look at the tools, notice how there's this connect for like Drive Search. All of this is essentially how do we provide a login mechanism that then enables you to provide a token without having to have someone whisper like, hey, LM, my API key is ... which a lot of people are doing in like hackathons today, which you want to avoid, right? It's okay for the request that's being sent to your tools have that authentication token, but you wouldn't want to send that to the LLM. So that's kind of a pattern right now that is still kind of being worked out in the MCP protocol itself. Whatever comes out of that, we definitely will be working towards and supporting in there and everything. Right now, we're kind of talking about how do we support things like passing through the authentication header in that tool call that's happening. Again, we're kind of limited with what the MCP primitives are right now. So that as it evolves, we'll add more. I'll definitely have a stream in the near future that specifically gets into this once I think we have a picture coming from the community that is worthwhile sending for y'all. One of the things I've done a lot locally is like if I'm running a GraphQL API or if I'm interacting with GraphQL API where I do need to send over a token, a thing, you can use Rover Dev to spin up a router locally and pass through that header value to that downstream API. It just wouldn't be coming from the client in that standpoint. Great question. Definitely a follow-up stream coming for that. How does it handle very large supergraph schemas? Does it chunk it or vectorize the schemas? That is an amazing question. I actually worked with a hackathon where the schema that they used was about 3 megabytes in size, immediately blew up the introspection tool in the first form we had. This is one reason why we actually created the depth inside of there. So if we looked at this inspector real quick, just at the introspection, when I go out to a 0 depth, that's going to be getting what the whole schema is. And is this, oh, did I stop my server? No, I didn't. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so when I just did at the root with 0, you can see it starts returning like the entire schema inside of here. So one of the things that we found is when you actually have a very, very large schema, when you send it over to the LLM, you can quickly exceed the context token. To give some ideas, the GitHub schema, which is about 66,000 lines of code, that's about 300,000 context tokens when you send it to the LLM. Now, with this tool, what it essentially happens is as we do questions of what's going on into the query, and actually, let's make this like very real. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag over. Here is the GitHub schema. It's giant, very big schema. So let's actually load that schema up. Schema.docs.graphql. Okay. Run and what I'm going to do though is I'm going to take out the operations just so we're looking at only that introspection tool. Okay. So it just loaded up. You can see that giant schema just flashed through inside of there. All right. So we have introspect. Now, when I just look at query in here, you can see here's the query node from the GitHub schema. It's pretty large still, just by itself. But that is significantly less tokens than everything else that we see. I actually have, I'm going to really stretch my demo superpowers here and see if this works. I do have a connector for, I thought I had a connector for Anthropic that'll let me see how many tokens this costs. I do. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so I'm going to copy this value. String escape online. Got to use some string escaping. Okay, copy that. And I have a graph for Anthropic that allows me to say I'm going to create a little, paste in that value. So basically now I'm just counting. What is the tokens? Oh, shoot. I forgot. This won't let you do any other operation inside of that. Okay. Well, I was trying to count how many tokens this is, but this amount of tokens is significantly less than what would happen with the full schema. And so this is one of the ways of how we're able to handle a very large schema is allowing the LLM to triage into specific nodes. So we're not providing the entire context of the schema through there. Okay. The demonstration appears to have covered functionality for a single subgraph schema. However, will the implementation also support a supergraph schema? It does support supergraph schema. It's either schema works inside of that. I'm a QA engineer. I thought it will help me write a test where I could say, please use the mutation with the data to generate me a test file. That is not necessarily the primary use case of what we put this together. Something I'll try and investigate a little bit. Maybe that could be a future stream as well. Is Apollo MCP more for developers? Like, is it a good use case to expose the MCP clients and agents directly to Apollo MCP? Yeah, Apollo MCP, I would say it's definitely more for developers. It's really for anyone who wants to make some tools based off of a GraphQL API, but it's definitely a developer tool. Like if you were a company and you had a GraphQL API, or even if you had a REST API and you wanted to start like creating an MCP server for your company's functionalities for your customers, Apollo MCP would be a great thing for something like that. And there's definitely a few people that are asking about like a more introspection, natural, I want it to dynamically generate operations. I think it kind of depends. Two scenarios. You have public facing assistance agents where it's like, something your customers are going to use. And for those situations, you typically have a lot of functionality that's already in your website, your mobile app, your APIs that you want to use and kind of bring into the fold. And that's where those operations are really great for. The introspect and execute, though, is a direction we're definitely exploring more and can continue exploring. Is how do we have a dynamic operation execution type thing? One of the things servers do have is they have the option of shipping prompts. I'm kind of pushing for how do we maybe have some prompts that help follow that happy path inside of there. Okay, I got 5 more questions that I'm going to run through, and then I think we'll call it at that. So another question from Hugh. Can the MCP be used to develop schemas or just operations? Oh, I think I already covered that. Oh, wait, I said 5 left and I'm duplicating some of these. Okay, I lied. I only have I have 2 questions. One, in case of using federated GraphQL, where the supergraph is used to aggregate all of the subgraphs, how to pass the schema as it's getting generated at runtime in supergraph. So one of the things you might be doing, and just to I guess talk about that application we had running right here, I'm in the right folder. Yeah. So there's this command rovers supergraph compose, and it basically composes a configuration of multiple APIs. This is Apollo Federation. And, that supergraph composition, this is like the artifact that comes out of that, right? And so this is the file that they're mentioning here of what could be dynamically created. Now, what I would say is like this schema that's inside of here, you're going to need to restart the MCP server if you want to dynamically load this schema in here. We don't have hot reload in there for that. If you are using GraphOS, the question earlier about uplink, that schema does hot reload off of uplink. So I would say if you want to have that hot reload, that's where GraphOS would need to be involved. I see, what would a typical workflow look like for teams working on a subgraph? How are they contributing operations from their subgraph to an MCP server connecting to the supergraph? That's a really good question. I haven't really thought about this in the workflow of like a subgraph team authoring those operations. I think it would still follow the same workflow of what we had here. It's just more of when you think about the MCP tools, there's 2 worlds I'm seeing evolve. There's kind of like we have an MCP server and has our functionality. And then for the companies that are going this direction, they're starting to look at, we have so many MCP tools that we're going to create that it's actually going to exceed what the context window is. So every time you send a question to Claude or any of these LLMs with tools, you're sending the tool name and description to the LLM so it can pick which one it wants. So, when you think about like agents and being able to toggle on and off, you kind of have domains of your business. And it might be like, I'm using, Stripe, and I want to use the Stripe checkout MCP server, or I want to use the Stripe, X MCP server, right? Because I only want to use like that functionality, that tools. Like the other tools don't matter to me in that world. And so, we've definitely thought about of like how do each one of those individual teams like support their things and everything like that. If you're using GraphOS, the way we see it is, you have multiple persisted query lists. Those could all be associated with a variant in GraphOS. That variant, those persisted query lists, that could all be associated with an MCP server and what's inside of there. So I would say, the contributing of operations would be to specific persisted query lists, and you'd probably just want to organize those in a way that makes sense for your subgraph teams. I think over this next year, we'll be working on developing a lot more workflows of how something like that would work. Like I've talked about, what does it look like potentially to have operation collections that are associated with a persisted query list that are associated with a set of tools that an MCP server can create. So the follow-up on that question was if introspection is disabled on our production graphs, can it still be used without introspection? It can. the LLM actually isn't loading any of the schema into context when it's using that tool. The tool, think about is like this, the tool and what the LLM's using is just the name and the description. When it decides to execute that tool, it sends that tool input parameters and the tool name to the MCP server. And then the MCP server does whatever it is and returns the results to the LLM. So the size of the schema actually won't matter, or whether introspection's working on the graph or not, because we've actually provided the schema as a file to the MCP server. So that really keeps the cost concern in check there. All right. I said there was 5 questions left. I only did 2 because there were some duplicates. In that time, 5 more questions came up. So let's just quickly get through those. I saw another question about dynamic headers. I think we're going to just have to follow up on that with another stream in there. I see another question about passing through user contact information. Data access policies on the graph will be adhered to. I think this is going to be a follow-up session as well. And I think the big thing there is, that having that demo outline how the authenticated, the scope works in trimming down what that query plan execution is. Is there a forum or Discord which I can ask more technical questions regarding the MCP server? That is a great question. If you went to our community, apollographql.com, inside here, this is our community forums. We do have a MCP server category. Feel free to ask some questions in here. We'll help out. There's a great, I'll give a shout out to David, who did some stuff at a Y Combinator this weekend, which was fantastic. They gave a little write-up inside of here. They actually reached out, and I jumped on a call with them on Saturday to help support them for this hackathon, which definitely something I do a lot of. So jump in these forums, ask some questions, and we'll do our best to help out. These pre-built connectors are useful. Where can we get them? Are there any demos for the pre-built connectors? Wow, y'all are asking my favorite questions. So there's a couple things. Pre-built connectors. We have this connectors community. This is where we put these in here. There's a lot of connectors inside of here. Now, what we've started doing is we've also started creating a little experience around here. So like, for example, the space devs, here's all those API points in there, the super graph config that I was looking at, Stripe. I was saying like, oh, am I using the checkout? Am I using the products? Am I using the payment methods? So there's something from the core resources. There's a lot in here. Each one of these, what we've also started doing is we have a section. If you go to our connectors page, we have these pre-built connectors where we're starting to showcase, some of these in here. So I'll look at like the Stripe one, for example. Each page has some information, but more specifically, for the ones that we have on those pre-built, you can actually come in here and just try out what's in here. So I kind of have a hosted version. We do some stuff so you can kind of see the query plan, the debugger. We sanitize out authentication header. It allows you to kind of come in here, expand. You can also, for any of these, put your own authorization and put your own like bearer, API key in here. And we just pass through the header to the downstream API. So if you want to see with your own stuff, that's all there. And then there's a little getting started explanation of what to do. It actually just links to that connectors community right now. We're going to build out some more documentation and stuff inside of there. But each one of these pages kind of gives this little experience. Some of them also have some things. So if I looked at like the OpenAI one, Sandbox caches your tab. So you have to delete the tab to generate the default one. We do have some requirements of, using things in default just so we could limit the spend of what's going on since we're using our token in the background. So if I came in here and said like, oh, I want to look at the models that Apollo has in here, you can see it gives us a little error. This is what happened in the Anthropic one. But if I pulled open just to show the authentication token working, I think if I do authentication or authorization, bearer, and I think I can just do my open API key right here. I was not prepared for this, so hopefully it all just works. Yeah, okay, cool. So these are actually the models that I have access to in my specific OpenAI account. Right. So you can pass through your own header inside of there. So it's kind of like you could try those out, see what it's like. Then if you like it, you could basically use the schemas, run it with the Apollo router and get started in there. And then, I always plug our tutorials. We have a great one around connectors. That's Michelle in there. One of our fantastic instructors. This is also a great way to just learn more about like what those connectors are and everything. Okay, last question. How do you load balance your MCP server? Does it require session stickiness? That is such a good question, and I have no clue how to answer that. I don't know how to load balance an MCP server. That's something I'll start keeping an eye out for in the industry. I think one of the things I would say, the reason we built our MCP server as a Rust binary is for performance and for scalability. It's like the same thing with the Apollo router. So I think that's going to be really important when you're thinking about the MCP servers you run. But I think the industry MCP community as a whole, load balancing is something they need to think about. Woo! Well, I hope y'all enjoyed this. This has been a really fun stream for me. I know we went over like 20 minutes. For everyone that stuck around for this long, thank you so much. I definitely will talk with our team internally and we'll figure out how we can get a follow-up stream on authentication, kind of passing through header tokens, all of that. And we'll share with the community when we have that. If you have any questions, find us in those community forums. And as always, happy hacking, and can't wait to see what you build with the MCP server. All right, thanks. Bye.